Welcome to the fourth video of our early modern and modern British history. So in this period, we're looking at the Georgian era, and the Georgian era lasted from 1714 to 1837. And like all the other eras discussed before, it too is named after the reigning monarchs of the time. So conveniently, for the purpose of understanding this era, it spans the rule of four kings named George: George I, George II, George III, and George IV. So this family line was called the Hanoverians, and they were partially related to the Stuart family, who had come before, but they mainly came from Germany, what is now Germany. So Britain once again had been influenced by non-British leaders. So the Georgian period was a time of great achievements in architecture and literature, amongst many other things. However, events in the world of arts were hardly the only notable achievements. This era would also see the 13 colonies, what would become modern-day USA, break away, the Napoleonic Wars, the beginnings of industrialization, the formation of the East India Company, and a vast expansion of British power around the globe. So first of all, let's start with the arts. So in Britain, writers such as Mary Shelley, Daniel Defoe, and Jane Austen would start to leave their mark on the heritage of the English language. So Mary Shelley herself wrote the well-known horror novel Frankenstein. In this novel, Dr. Frankenstein creates a new man by piecing together dead body parts from various corpses and uses electricity to bring this monster back to life. So in a way, this story reflected a period sense of fascination and fear that were brought on by the scientific progress of this time. There are also numerous poets from this era, such as Wordsworth, Keats, and Blake. And these great writers were living in the context of sweeping scientific and technological process. So this era of scientific and technological process and progress, so this era is known as the Enlightenment. And it included a blossoming of new ideas about the rights of regular citizens, separation of church and state, and human liberty and human happiness. So separation of church and state was a particularly interesting idea at the time, as it cemented the distinction between the religious influence and that of the laws of the country. So it marked the beginning of a long trend in Western societies, whereby the importance of religion and its role in shaping people's thoughts and attitudes declined. So institutions such as the church had declined, but new ideas and philosophies started to appeal to the people that lived in Britain. So one of the most influential was the school of thought known as liberalism. So liberalism is the concept of the individual being more well supported by the law and equality for all levels of society. So instead of having the hierarchy, people will be much more equal. Later on, Marxism would gain widespread popularity as the Industrial Revolution drove people into cities to work in manufacturing. So in short, the social upheaval of this era was deep and very encompassing. Furthermore, it was not only Britain that these changes were taking place, but all throughout Europe and the Americas as well. So during this time, the British Empire was still powerful, but there were problems starting to show. So the breakaway rebellion from what became the USA was embarrassing, but the British Empire still managed to dominate trade around the world, mainly through its powerful Royal Navy. So the British East India Company was a unique company in that it was set up by Britain to trade in the Indian Ocean, but actually eventually expanded beyond its creation. It was a symbol of the power and the wealth of the shipping traders. And it became so powerful, it actually began to behave more like a kind of nation to itself, taking lands and having its own army. Eventually, the British government had to break it up because it became so powerful that even the British Empire began to feel a little bit insecure around it. So Britain has always had an uneasy relationship with France ever since the Norman era, and there have been many wars over the centuries. However, during this period, France had a dynamic and charismatic leader under Napoleon that united France and the French colonies under his rule. He would eventually become an emperor, and the conflict between France and Britain, who were the two superpowers of the time, this affected much of the trade and government policy for both nations. The wars themselves were unique in that they actually never really took place on land of either Britain or mainland France, but they were actually fought in colonies and often out to sea. So naval combat was a frequent event in this time period, and the ships that were built were powerful and very combat effective. Eventually, Napoleon was beaten, and Britain resumed her dominating behavior globally. So an interesting sidebar to this era was the architecture. So the interesting architecture of the time, this meant that buildings were built to resemble ancient Greek or Roman style, as this was becoming popular in British society at the time. Great houses with gardens became popular, and we can see the architecture style often in the colonies of Britain, such as the USA, that actually still survive today. So living in cities became more popular for the upper classes. Previously, they preferred to live in the countryside. So the upper classes preferred to live in the cities, and the city itself was seen as a place of power and influence. And so many people had their houses in London and the surrounding area of London. But not just the rich people, many workers also came to the city as the Industrial Revolution meant the jobs that had centered around the factories of the cities were there, and there was less farming going on that had happened before. It was a type of rural to urban migration.